everyone. I'm Sandra Levy, Senior Editor of Drugstore News. Today we have Michael Ganio, Senior Director of Pharmacy Practice and Quality at the American Society of Health System Pharmacists. Thank you for joining us today, Michael.
Thank you for having me, Sandra.
Oh, you're quite welcome. So the United States Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs recently issued a report titled The Health and National Security Risks of Drug Shortages. It showed that shortages of critical medicines are on the rise, and ASHP is tracking 300 drugs that are in shortage. That said, what drugs and therapeutic categories are experiencing the greatest shortages, and what impact do these shortages have on patient care, Michael?
Well, as you noted, we're tracking nearly 300. We'll be updating those statistics shortly. We update them quarterly, so we'll have first quarter 2023 data soon. But some of the more concerning agents that are on that list right now are chemotherapy drugs, particularly intravenous, and we're talking older, sterile, generic injectable medications, and that's across all shortages, not just chemotherapy, but specifically older medications like lidocaine, bupivacaine, some anesthetics, some paralyzing agents, things we used a lot during COVID actually were already in shortage prior to the pandemic. So the impact to patient care really depends on the medication, if there's a suitable alternative that's readily available. But in general, the drug of choice is the drug of choice for a reason. There's either an optimal efficacy or patient clinical outcome. There's a better side effect profile, or it's more cost effective. So when we're using alternatives, it usually means we're using something that's maybe a little bit less effective. It may have more or different side effects, or it can be more costly.
That said, what is actually causing the spike in drug shortages? Are there more than one factor?
There actually are multiple factors, and this is an ongoing issue. We've been tracking shortages for 20 to 25 years, but they've really increased in the early 2010, 2012 timeframe. And there was some legislation then to try to address some of the shortages. But since that time, we've seen them decline, but now they're on the rise again. And there are several reasons. The first and foremost tends to be a quality manufacturing issue. Something within manufacturing process is held up. It could be the need for a plant inspection or reinspection and equipment, FDA authorizing a new supplier of raw materials, for example. Most of the time, it's somewhere within the manufacturing process. What we've seen recently, which is a little bit interesting, is demand-driven shortages. And these are some things that our watchers will probably be familiar with Ozempic and Wegovy, for example, the drugs used for weight loss. So there was a huge increase in demand for those medications, and that led to shortage. Social media influencers were part of the drivers there. We've seen an increase in demand for Adderall, the amphetamine products. And a lot of that has to do with the ability for patients to access providers during the public health emergency via telehealth. And they can get prescriptions for these medications remotely, whereas before an in-person visit was required. So that, whether it's increased access to healthcare that led to the increase in demand for these products, or if there was something else. I know some of the pharmacies have cut off some of the telehealth companies because they were suspicious of abuse. But again, it's an increase in demand. And then finally, over the winter months during the so-called triple-demic, we saw an increase in demand for things like over-the-counter children's analgesics and fever reducers, acetaminophen, ibuprofen. We saw an increase in demand for prescription amoxicillin and some anti-infectives like oseltamivir used for flu. So really, there's no one root cause. There are a few root causes, and then we've had this sort of new variable of increasing demand.
Mm-hmm. So with those problems, what are some solutions? Are there certain things that you can suggest as far as remedying this problem?
Yeah, and this is where it gets a little more complicated because there are so many different causes. How do we address each of these? There is some legislation that's been introduced that would require manufacturers to report to FDA when they see an increase in demand for their medication. So currently manufacturers have to report to the FDA when they expect a supply disruption. That can be up to 6 months in advance if they know they're doing some sort of plant upgrades, or it can be retrospective in the case of a natural disaster. We saw Hurricane Maria about 5 years ago had affected manufacturing on the island of Puerto Rico. Clearly not a lot of warning ahead of time for that. This new proposal would require manufacturers to also report to the FDA when there is an increase in demand. Now, this obviously needs to be, there needs to be some parameters here because we see seasonal increases in demand for, again, anti-infectives during the winter months. So there need to be some sort of parameters here, but that would give FDA a little more insight into what's happening within the supply chain, and they can respond as they do by reaching out to other manufacturers, asking to see if they can increase production. It just helps them get a bigger picture. As far as the quality issues, this one's much more complicated. There are a few factors that go into this. And again, we're talking about sterile generic injectable drugs. We're talking about generic prescription drugs that might be in our community pharmacies. There's not a lot of profit margin on these medications. And so there's no real incentive to invest in manufacturing quality. So what would be helpful is to have some transparency into that quality. How do we know whether, the FDA approval process is basically a pass-fail, meaning if an FDA drug is approved, we assume they're all equal and that each manufacturing facility is equal. But if you ever read FDA Form 483 inspection reports or warning letters, you know that not every plant is the same. So how can we incentivize investment into more quality manufacturing? Are there economic incentives? One of the ways to do that is to direct buyers to give them more information so that they're supporting a facility that's investing in quality, that has more resilient supply chains, and is less likely to go into shortage. And then speaking of supply chains, one of the vulnerabilities could be that many of these manufacturers could use a single node as a source for some part of the manufacturing process, whether that's the active ingredient, whether that's an excipient or inactive ingredient, whether it's a key starting material needed to manufacture the product. It could even be part of the container closures, so the bottles, the glass vials, the stoppers. If there's a single node or even two nodes where everything is dependent, that introduces a vulnerability. So more transparency further upstream also gives us some ability to address those choke points or those potential bottlenecks.
So beyond that, how can pharmacists help patients when they come in and a drug is not available?
And this is frustrating. I know pharmacies, in particular in the community setting, are facing some staffing shortages with, technician workforce. We have a similar issue within hospitals too, where there's some technician workforce shortages, which just puts more strain on the staff that are trying to help the patients. But understanding the patient's perspective and understanding that this may require communication with the prescriber. It may require communication with the patient's insurance, depending on the medication that's being selected as an alternative. In some cases, insurers will cover the brand name product if the drug is on the FDA shortage list. So it may take some time to navigate insurance coverage as well. But have some patience and understanding of what the patient's going through. I know there's a lot of there's a lot of strain. As I said, we're emerging from flu season. I know pharmacies were very busy administering COVID vaccine boosters and influenza shots, but hopefully some of that workload is easing, and unfortunately that means that there's more with these shortages. There could be more attention or focus on managing the shortages. The other thing is to get involved. Let your legislators know, let policymakers know that this is a major problem and how your patients are affected every day. I can get up there and I can talk to someone either in a state legislature or a federal, in Congress. They'll hear what I have to say, but what really drives change is the compelling stories that pharmacists on the front lines and patients can tell their legislators, how they had to turn someone away from getting a life-supporting medication. We look at a medication like Adderall, for example. Patients require this to function on a daily basis, to go to their jobs and work effectively, to drive. Sometimes it's used for narcolepsy, and some of the alternatives have been in short supply too. So think about how disruptive those are, these shortages are, and try to work with patients and prescribers.
That's important, definitely. So my last question, are there any examples you can give, OTCs where a drug is shortage, but there's an available alternative, maybe a brand that's not as well known. Can you give any examples on that area?
Well, for over-the-counter medications, we don't track them as closely just because there are so many NDCs and what are called relabelers. So most stores have their own brand of a product. So you may go to the store and you'll see Tylenol, and then you'll see some generics, and then you'll see the store brand. So it's really difficult for us to track shortages. But the most notable ones over the winter were children's acetaminophen and children's ibuprofen. And sometimes the alternative is the brand name product. It's more expensive. It might be sitting on the shelf right next to where the generics are. But this is an important, look at the class. What is the medication being used for? Is it being used for fever reduction? Well, if acetaminophen is not available, ibuprofen or one of the other NSAIDs, if it's suitable for a pediatric patient, for example, might be. If it's being used for headache, maybe there's a different product that's not a fever reducer or that's not affected by the shortage that's ongoing. So really, it's looking at the therapeutic need for the drug and seeing what's out there that's available.
Thank you so much, Michael. I really appreciate you shedding light on this important issue, and hopefully you'll come back and share some more information with us at a later time. I
would love to come back sometime and say we found the solution to the problem.
I certainly hope so. Thank you again.
Thank you.